Mr. Agbor was known throughout his neighborhood in Lagos as a man who believed only in what he could see. Every Sunday morning, his wife Martha and their 3 children would dress up in their colorful clothes to go to church, while he stayed home watching television or reading newspapers. Martha would always invite him, her gentle voice full of hope, but Mr. Agbor would just shake his head and say, "I don't need prayers. I can take care of myself." One hot afternoon, as Martha was preparing dinner, she received a call from Mr. Agbor's mother in their village. Mama was sick and needed help. When Martha told her husband the news, Mr. Agbor immediately started planning his journey. "I leave tomorrow morning," he declared. Martha felt worried and asked him to wait so they could pray about the journey, but Mr. Agbor laughed it off. "What's there to pray about? It's just a simple journey to the village," he said, not knowing that this trip would change his life forever. That night, Martha couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, feeling that something wasn't right about her husband's upcoming journey. In her dreams, she saw dark clouds gathering over the road to their village. When she woke up early the next morning, she tried one more time to convince Mr. Agbor to let her pray with him before his journey. "My husband," she said, holding his hands, "please, just 5 minutes of prayer." But Mr. Agbor pulled his hands away. "Martha, you worry too much. I've made this journey 100 times before. Nothing will happen to me." He picked up his traveling bag and walked out, leaving Martha standing at the door with tears in her eyes. She gathered their children, Joy, Daniel, and little Sarah, and they formed a prayer circle right there in the living room. "God," Martha prayed, "please protect my stubborn husband." Mr. Agbor started his journey early in the morning, feeling confident and strong. He drove his old blue car, which he had owned for many years. The morning sun was bright, and the roads leaving Lagos were busy with people going to work. He turned on the radio and hummed along to his favorite songs, thinking about how worried Martha had been. "Women and their endless prayers," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. As he drove further away from the city, the roads became quieter and less maintained. Potholes appeared more frequently, and the trees grew thicker on both sides of the road. Mr. Agbor noticed dark clouds gathering in the distance, but he didn't think much about it. A little rain never hurt anybody, he thought, pressing down harder on the gas pedal to make better time. He didn't know that those clouds were the same ones Martha had seen in her dream. The weather changed quickly, just as Martha had feared. The dark clouds rolled in faster than Mr. Agbor expected, and soon fat raindrops began hitting his windshield. He turned on his wipers, but they made a scratching sound. He hadn't changed them in years, despite Martha's reminders. The rain got heavier and heavier until it was like a thick curtain of water falling from the sky. Other cars on the road slowed down or pulled over to wait out the storm, but Mr. Agbor kept driving. "I've driven in rain before," he told himself confidently. But this rain was different. It was so heavy that he could barely see the road ahead. The wind howled around his car like an angry spirit, and thunder boomed overhead. For the first time since leaving home, Mr. Agbor felt a tiny spark of fear in his heart. The rain continued to pour as Mr. Agbor's car splashed through huge puddles on the road. Suddenly, his engine made a strange coughing sound. The car jerked forward, then settled back to normal. Mr. Agbor frowned. This had never happened before. He remembered how Martha always insisted on having the car checked before long trips, but he had ignored her last week when she mentioned it. A few minutes later, the engine coughed again, louder this time. Mr. Agbor's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He was still 4 hours away from the village, and there were no mechanics around for miles. "Please," he whispered to the car, "just keep going." It was the closest thing to a prayer he had said in years. Meanwhile, back in Lagos, Martha couldn't focus on her work. She kept thinking about her husband. The children noticed their mother's worry during lunch. "Mommy, is Daddy okay?" asked little Sarah, picking at her rice. Martha forced a smile. "We must keep praying for him," she said, gathering her children once again to pray. Joy, the oldest at 12, closed her eyes tightly as they prayed. Daniel, who was 10, peeked occasionally at his mother's concerned face. Sarah, only 6, didn't fully understand what was happening, but she held her mother's hand tightly. Martha's voice trembled as she prayed, "Lord, please don't let my dream come true. Protect him." The engine finally gave up with a loud bang, leaving Mr. Agbor stranded on a lonely stretch of road. Thick forest surrounded him on both sides, and the rain had turned into a light drizzle. He tried starting the car several times, but it only made weak clicking sounds. For the first time, real fear gripped his heart. He checked his phone, no signal. The trees were too thick, blocking the network. Mr. Agbor stepped out of the car, hoping to find a better signal. His shoes sank into the mud as he walked around, holding his phone up high. Nothing. He was completely alone, just as Martha had feared he would be. As Mr. Agbor stood by his car, wondering what to do next, he heard rustling in the bushes. An old man emerged, wearing traditional clothes and carrying a walking stick. Despite the rain, the old man's clothes were completely dry. "You seem troubled, my son," the old man said with a kind smile. Mr. Agbor was surprised but relieved to see another person. He explained his situation, and the old man nodded wisely. "Sometimes," the old man said, "our greatest troubles come to teach us our greatest lessons. Your wife is praying for you right now." Mr. Agbor's eyes widened. How did this stranger know about Martha's prayers? The old man tapped Mr. Agbor's car with his walking stick 3 times. "Try starting it now," he said. Skeptical but desperate, Mr. Agbor got back into the car and turned the key. To his amazement, the engine roared to life, running smoother than it had in years. He quickly turned to thank the old man, but when he looked outside, there was no one there. Mr. Agbor rubbed his eyes in disbelief. He got out and looked around, calling out, "Hello. Where are you?" But the old man had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. The rain had stopped completely, and a rainbow stretched across the sky. For the first time, Mr. Agbor wondered if Martha's prayers had something to do with this strange encounter. Despite his walking car, Mr. Agbor's troubles went over. Night was falling quickly, and the road ahead grew darker and more dangerous. The street lights that usually lit the highway weren't working. He had to drive slowly, straining to see the road ahead in his headlights. Strange shadows seemed to dance at the edges of the light. He remembered Martha's words about praying before the journey. Now, in the darkness, he wished he had listened. Every tree looked like a threatening figure, and every sound made him jump. He began to understand that his wife's prayers weren't just empty words, they were like an invisible shield of protection. Around midnight, Mr. Agbor reached the old bridge that crossed the river Niger. It was the last major obstacle before reaching his village. Usually, crossing this bridge was no problem, but tonight was different. The earlier rain had made the bridge slippery, and parts of it were covered in thick fog. As he slowly drove onto the bridge, his headlights caught something ahead, a huge hole in the bridge's surface, partially hidden by the fog. Mr. Agbor slammed on his brakes, and the car skidded dangerously close to the edge. His heart pounded as he realized how close he had come to driving straight into the hole. If he hadn't seen it in time. At that exact moment, back in Lagos, Martha woke up with a start. She had dozed off while praying but was awakened by a strong feeling that her husband was in danger. Without waking the children, she went to their small prayer room and fell to her knees. "God," she prayed with tears streaming down her face, "whatever danger is facing my husband right now, please save him." The children found her there in the morning, still praying. Joy brought her a cup of tea, while Daniel and Sarah hugged her tightly. "Don't worry, Mommy," Sarah said with childish wisdom, "God is bigger than any trouble Daddy can face." After carefully navigating around the hole in the bridge, Mr. Agbor finally reached his village as the sun was rising. His mother was waiting at the door of her small house, looking worried. "My son," she said, hugging him tightly, "we've been praying for you all night. Something told me you were in danger." Mr. Agbor was surprised to learn that his mother, too, had been praying. He told her about the strange events of his journey, the broken car, the mysterious old man, and the dangerous bridge. His mother listened quietly, then said, Sometimes God has to take us through troubled waters to show us we need Him. Later that morning, Mr. Agbor finally got a phone signal and called Martha. When she heard his voice, she burst into tears of relief. "Oh, my husband. You're safe." He told her everything that had happened, and for the first time, he didn't laugh when she mentioned prayer. Instead, he asked quietly, "Were you praying for me last night?" Martha told him about her vision and how she had prayed through the night. Mr. Agbor felt a lump in his throat as he realized that his wife's prayers might have been the only thing standing between him and disaster. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. While Mr. Agbor helped his mother with her medicine, she shared stories from his childhood. She told him about how his late father had been just like him, stubborn and unwilling to pray, until a similar experience changed him. "Your father learned that being strong doesn't mean you don't need God," she said, holding his hand. Mr. Agbor listened carefully to his mother's words. He remembered the fear he had felt on the dark road, and how the mysterious old man had appeared just when he needed help most. For the first time in his adult life, he began to wonder if there was more to prayer than he had thought. The village doctor came to check on Mama and prescribed some new medicine. As they talked, the doctor mentioned that the bridge Mr. Agbor had crossed was now closed. "A bus nearly fell through that hole this morning," he said. "They say anyone who crossed that bridge in the fog last night must have had angels watching over them." Mr. Agbor sat quietly, thinking about how close he had come to disaster. The doctor's words about angels made him remember the old man who had fixed his car. Had he been more than just a kind stranger? The questions in his mind were beginning to change the way he saw the world. During his stay in the village, Mr. Agbor noticed things he had never paid attention to before. He saw how the villagers always prayed before making any journey, how they thanked God for every meal, and how they helped each other in times of need. Their faith wasn't just about going to church, it was a way of life. One evening, as he watched the sunset with his mother, she told him about the old man he had met on the road. "Years ago," she said, "people used to tell stories about a wise elder who helped troubled travelers. They say he appears to those who need him most, especially when someone is praying for them." Every evening, Mr. Agbor's children called to talk to him. During one call, little Sarah asked, "Daddy, are you going to pray with us when you come home?" Instead of his usual dismissive laugh, Mr. Agbor found himself saying, "Yes, Sarah, I think I will." The joy in his daughter's voice made his heart feel warm. Joy and Daniel were surprised by their father's answer but happy. Martha, listening in the background, felt tears of joy rolling down her cheeks. She had prayed for this change in her husband for so many years, and now it seemed God was answering her prayers in an unexpected way. After a week, Mama was feeling much better, and it was time for Mr. Agbor to return home. This time, before leaving, he did something he had never done before. He asked his mother to pray for his journey. Mama's eyes filled with tears of joy as she placed her hands on his head and prayed. The village gathered to see him off, and many shared their own stories of God's protection on the roads. Mr. Agbor listened with new ears and an open heart. As he started his car, he found himself whispering his own simple prayer, "God, please keep me safe on this journey." The return journey was very different from his first trip. The sun was shining, the roads were clear, and his car ran perfectly. But the biggest difference was in Mr. Agbor himself. Every time he passed a place where something had happened on his previous journey, he said a quiet, "Thank you" prayer. When he reached the bridge, now repaired, he stopped for a moment. Looking at the new concrete filling the hole that had almost claimed his life, he fully understood how close he had come to disaster. "Thank you for my wife's prayers," he whispered, before carefully driving across. Martha and the children were waiting at the door when Mr. Agbor arrived home. Sarah ran to him first, jumping into his arms. Joy and Daniel followed, hugging him tightly. But when he looked at Martha, both of them knew that something had changed. Without saying a word, he hugged her and whispered, "Thank you for never stopping your prayers." That evening, for the first time ever, the whole family sat together for prayers before dinner. Mr. Agbor was awkward and unsure of what to say, but his simple "thank you" God brought tears of joy to Martha's eyes. Their family circle was finally complete. The next Sunday morning, Martha and the children got ready for church as usual. But this time, something was different. Mr. Agbor came out of his room wearing his best clothes. "I think it's time I join my family," he said. Sarah clapped her hands in delight, while Joy and Daniel exchanged excited looks. The whole church seemed to stop and stare when Mr. Agbor walked in with his family. Many had prayed with Martha for this day. After the service, Mr. Agbor stood up and shared his story about his stubbornness, the dangerous journey, the mysterious old man, and how his wife's prayers had saved his life. Over the next few weeks, people noticed many changes in Mr. Agbor. He became calmer and more patient. He started each day with prayers with his family. He even began helping others, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. "Prayer isn't just words," he would say. "It's a shield of protection and a bridge to God." Martha watched these changes with a grateful heart. Sometimes, she would catch him praying quietly by himself, and her heart would fill with joy. The children adapted quickly to the new family routine, and their home was filled with more love and peace than ever before. One day, while Mr. Agbor was driving home from work, he saw a familiar figure on the road, the old man who had helped him during his journey. This time, he stopped the car immediately. But when he got out to talk to him, the old man simply smiled and said, "You've learned your lesson well, my son." Before Mr. Agbor could say anything more, the old man vanished again. But this time, Mr. Agbor wasn't shocked or scared. Instead, he felt a deep sense of peace and gratitude. He now understood that some things couldn't be explained, they could only be believed. Inspired by his experience, Mr. Agbor and his family started a new tradition. Every month, they would help travelers who were stranded on the roads. They kept emergency supplies in their car and offered assistance to anyone in need. "God helped me through others," Mr. Agbor would say, "now it's my turn to help." Martha was proud of how her husband had changed. Their children learned valuable lessons about faith, kindness, and the power of never giving up on someone you love. Their home became known in the neighborhood as a place where people could come for prayer and help in times of trouble. 1 year after his life-changing journey, Mr. Agbor organized a Thanksgiving service. People came from both his village and the city to celebrate. His mother, now healthy and strong, sat in the front row, beaming with pride as her son shared his testimony again. During the service, many others shared stories of how Mr. Agbor's change had inspired them to take prayer more seriously. Even some of his old friends, who used to spend Sundays watching television with him, were now regular churchgoers. His story had created a ripple effect of change in the community. Martha's dream of a united family in faith had finally come true, but in a way she had never expected. One evening, as they sat together after family prayers, she told Mr. Agbor about all the years she had prayed for him. "I never prayed for something dramatic to happen," she said. "I just prayed for your heart to open." Mr. Agbor held her hand tightly. "Sometimes," he replied, "God has to take us through the valley to make us look up to the mountains." Their children, listening nearby, smiled at their parents' wisdom and love. As time passed, Mr. Agbor became known as a prayer warrior in his community. People would come to him for advice and prayer, just as they used to come to Martha. He never forgot his journey from doubt to faith and always remained humble about his transformation. He taught his children the importance of both prayer and action. "Prayer without action is like a car without fuel," he would say, "and action without prayer is like driving in the dark without headlights." His children grew up understanding the perfect balance between faith and responsibility. Years later, Mr. Agbor took his family back to the spot where he had met the mysterious old man. The road had been improved, and there were now houses where there used to be thick forest. But the memory of that night remained clear in his mind. As they stood there, he told his children the full story again. Sarah, now a teenager, asked, "Daddy, do you think the old man was an angel?" Mr. Agbor smiled and replied, "Whether he was an angel or a man sent by God, he changed my life forever." The story of Mr. Agbor became a testimony that was shared far and wide. It taught people that it's never too late to change, that prayer has power, and that love and patience can move mountains. Martha's years of faithful prayers had not only saved her husband's life but had also created a legacy of faith for generations to come. In their old age, Mr. and Mrs. Agbor would sit on their porch, watching their grandchildren play. They would remember the dangerous journey that had started their spiritual adventure and thank God for turning a near tragedy into a testimony. Their story became a reminder that sometimes the longest journey we make is the one from doubt to faith, from stubbornness to surrender, and from resistance. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more stories like this.